The morning sun cast long shadows across the Wyoming prairie as Emma Thornton stood at her bedroom window, watching dust devils dance across the barren fields. At 21, she had her mother's delicate features and her father's stubborn chin, though neither trait would serve her well today. The drought had taken everything, the corn, the wheat, even the hardy vegetables in her mother's garden. Now it threatened to take something far more precious: her freedom. "Emma, come down." Her father's voice carried up the stairs, heavy with the weight of decisions no father should have to make. Samuel Thornton had aged 10 years in the past too, his once proud shoulders now bent under the burden of unpaid debts and failed harvests. She smoothed her best dress, a faded blue calico that had seen better days, and descended the creaking stairs. The small parlor was crowded with unfamiliar faces, rough men who looked out of place among her mother's carefully preserved china and embroidered cushions. At the center stood a man she recognized only from whispered conversations at the general store. Jake McCready, outlaw, cattle rustler, and now, impossibly, her intended husband. McCready was perhaps 40, with cold gray eyes that missed nothing and hands that had never known honest work. His expensive black coat and silver-studded gun belt spoke of ill-gotten wealth, while the scar running from his left ear to his jaw told darker stories. When he smiled at her approach, it was the smile of a wolf appraising prey. "Miss Thornton," he said, removing his hat with mock courtesy. "You're even prettier than your father promised." Emma's stomach churned, but she kept her expression neutral. Her mother, Sarah, stood in the corner, tears streaming silently down her weathered cheeks. Her younger brother Tom, only 15, clenched his fists at his sides, powerless rage written across his freckled face. "Mr. McCready has been generous," her father said, the words seeming to choke him. "He's agreed to forgive our debts to his associates in exchange for—" He couldn't finish. "In exchange for a beautiful bride," McCready completed smoothly. "A man gets lonely out here on the frontier, needs a woman's touch to make a house a home." The irony wasn't lost on Emma. Everyone knew McCready's ranch was built on stolen cattle and fear. His associates were the very men who had driven up the interest on her father's loans when the crops failed, creating the trap that now snapped shut around her. "When?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Today," McCready answered. "The Reverend's waiting at the church. No sense in delay when two hearts are meant to be together." Two of his men chuckled at this, and Emma noticed they kept their hands near their weapons. This wasn't a proposal. It was a collection on a debt. The walk to the church felt like a funeral procession. Word had spread quickly through the small town of Cedar Ridge, and folks lined the dusty main street to witness the spectacle. Some watched with pity, others with the morbid curiosity reserved for public hangings. Emma kept her eyes forward, her arm trapped in McCready's possessive grip. The church was packed, though the atmosphere bore no resemblance to the joyful weddings Emma had attended in happier times. Reverend Morrison looked pale and uncomfortable, clutching his Bible like a shield. McCready's men filled the back pews, while the townspeople crowded wherever they could find space. As Emma took her place at the altar, her gaze swept across the congregation and stopped on a figure standing near the door. Sheriff Daniel Wade cut an imposing figure even in the crowded church, tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-weathered skin and earnest brown eyes. He wore his badge like a burden. He was perhaps 30, young for a sheriff, but his reputation for fairness and courage had earned him respect even among the rougher elements of Cedar Ridge. Their eyes met for a moment, and Emma saw something flicker across his face: regret, anger, maybe even longing. They had danced together once, at last year's harvest festival, back when there had been something to celebrate. He had been gentle and respectful, making her laugh with stories of his childhood in Kansas. She had hoped, but that was before the drought, before the debts, before her world narrowed to this moment. Sheriff Wade's jaw tightened as he watched her turn back to face McCready. His hand rested on his gun belt, but they both knew the law offered no protection here. This was a willing marriage in the eyes of the law, even if everyone could see the chains that bound her. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Morrison began, his voice trembling. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of Jake McCready and Emma Thornton." The words washed over Emma like water over stone. She made the responses when prompted, her voice mechanical and distant. McCready's men shifted restlessly, eager to get to the saloon for the celebration their boss had promised. Her mother wept openly now, supported by Tom, whose young face had hardened into a mask of hatred as he stared at McCready. "If anyone knows of any reason why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony," the Reverend continued, pausing longer than usual, his eyes darting hopefully around the room. "Speak now or forever hold your peace." The church fell silent. Emma found herself looking at Sheriff Wade again, a wild hope fluttering in her chest. His hand had tightened on his gun, his whole body tense with barely controlled emotion. For a heartbeat, she thought he might speak, might object, might save her from this nightmare. But the moment passed. The sheriff's shoulders sagged slightly, and he looked away. The law was the law, and debts had to be paid. Emma felt the last ember of hope die in her chest. "Then by the power vested in me," Reverend Morrison continued reluctantly, "I now pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss the bride." McCready's kiss was possessive and triumphant, a claim staked before the whole town. Emma endured it, her mind already retreating to somewhere safe and distant. When he finally released her, she saw Sheriff Wade had gone, leaving only an empty space where he had stood. The reception at the saloon was a mockery of celebration. McCready's men drank heavily and made crude jokes, while the townspeople who felt obligated to attend sat in uncomfortable clusters. Emma sat beside her new husband, his hand heavy on her shoulder, marking his ownership. "You'll learn to be happy," McCready told her, his breath hot with whiskey. "I take care of what's mine." Through the saloon window, Emma caught a glimpse of Sheriff Wade standing across the street, watching the revelry with dark eyes. When he saw her looking, he touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that might have been farewell or promise, then turned and walked back toward his office. As the sun set over Cedar Ridge, casting the town in shades of gold and shadow, Emma Thornton, now Emma McCready, wondered if she would ever see hope again. The wedding ring on her finger felt like a shackle, and the man beside her like a prison wall. But somewhere in the depths of her despair, a small voice whispered that even the strongest chains could be broken, given time and courage. The question was whether she would survive long enough to find out. The McCready Ranch sprawled across the valley like a dark stain on the landscape, its prosperity a stark contrast to the struggling homesteads surrounding it. Emma had been there 3 weeks now, 3 weeks of learning the rhythms of a household built on fear and ill-gotten gains. The house itself was grand by frontier standards, 2 stories of imported lumber with real glass windows and store-bought furniture that spoke of wealth but not taste. Emma rose before dawn, as had become her habit. Sleep came fitfully in the mahogany bed she shared with her husband, and she treasured these quiet morning hours when she could pretend to be alone. She dressed quickly in one of the new dresses McCready had bought her, silk and satin things that felt like costumes. Nothing like the practical calico she was accustomed to. The kitchen was her sanctuary. McCready's Mexican cook, Rosa, had taken pity on her from the first day, teaching her to make the spicy dishes her husband favored and sharing wordless sympathy over the chopping board. This morning, Rosa was already at work, kneading dough for the day's bread. "Señora," Rosa greeted her softly, "you are up early again." "I couldn't sleep," Emma admitted, pouring herself coffee from the pot on the stove. The bitter brew was nothing like her mother's mild chicory blend, but she had learned to appreciate its harsh comfort. Through the kitchen window, she could see McCrady's men beginning their day. They moved with the lazy confidence of those who knew their power came from the gun rather than honest work. Her husband employed nearly 20 men, though what legitimate ranch needed so many hands was a question she didn't dare ask. "The patron, he rode out last night," Rosa informed her carefully. "Business in the North pastures." Emma knew better than to inquire about this business. In 3 weeks, she had learned that McCrady's affairs were conducted in darkness and discussed in whispers. Men came to the house at odd hours, leaving packages that disappeared into the locked study where she was forbidden to enter. Her husband would be gone for days at a time, returning with new cattle that bore recently altered brands and money that smelled of gunpowder. The sound of horses approaching made both women tense, but it was only Buck Hartley, McCrady's segundo, a man whose dead eyes and quick temper made Emma's skin crawl. He dismounted and strode into the kitchen without knocking, a liberty that would have earned any other man a bullet. "Mrs. McCready," he drawled, his gaze lingering too long on her figure. "Boss wants you to go to town today, pick up some supplies, show yourself around, let folks see you're happy in your new life." Emma understood the real message. She was to be displayed like a prize horse, proof of McCready's power and respectability. "Of course," she replied evenly. "I'll take the wagon after breakfast. I'll send Carlos with you," Buck added, "so for protection." Protection or surveillance, Emma wondered, but merely nodded. Carlos was one of the younger hands, less hardened than the others, but still loyal to McCrady's gold. The ride to Cedar Ridge took 2 hours through countryside that should have been beautiful in its austere way, but Emma could see only the failed farms and abandoned homesteads, monuments to the drought and the predatory lenders who had followed in its wake. Carlos rode beside the wagon, rifle across his saddle, whistling tunelessly. The town seemed smaller each time she visited, as if it were shrinking under the weight of hard times. The general store, Murphy's Mercantile, was her first stop. Mrs. Murphy, a plump woman with kind eyes, greeted her with carefully neutral warmth. "Mrs. McCready, how nice to see you. What can I help you with today?" Emma handed over the list Rosa had prepared: flour, coffee, salt, and other staples. As Mrs. Murphy gathered the items, Emma became aware of the silence that had fallen over the other customers. Women who had once been friendly now avoided her eyes, while men stepped aside with a deference born of fear rather than respect. She was examining a bolt of fabric when the bell over the door chimed. Sheriff Wade entered, his presence immediately filling the space. He removed his hat upon seeing her, revealing hair the color of dark honey that needed cutting. "Mrs. McCready," he said formally. "Ma'am." "Sheriff," she replied, hating how her pulse quickened at his presence. He moved to the counter, discussing some matter of unpaid fines with Mrs. Murphy, but Emma felt his awareness of her like a physical thing. When their paths crossed near the door, he paused. "How are you finding married life?" he asked quietly, his eyes searching her face. "It's an adjustment," she managed, conscious of Carlos watching from outside. "If you ever need anything," he began, then stopped, frustration clear in his expression. What could he offer that wouldn't endanger them both? "You're investigating the Nelson Ranch incident," she said suddenly, remembering overheard conversations. The cattle that went missing last month. His eyes sharpened. Among other things, it's a busy time for lawmen. Yes, she agreed carefully. My husband mentioned there's been trouble with rustlers. He's quite concerned about protecting our stock. The sheriff's mouth tightened at the irony, but he played along. Any responsible rancher would be. These are dangerous times. Through the window, Emma saw Carlos growing restless. I should go, she said. Good day, Sheriff. Ma'am, he replied, but as she passed, he added quietly. My office door is always open, remember that. The rest of her errands passed in a blur. At the butcher shop, she overheard men discussing a raid on a ranch near the county line. At the church, Reverend Morrison pressed her hand with genuine concern and promised to pray for her. The sympathy in his eyes nearly undid her careful composure. It was at the post office that the day took an unexpected turn. As she waited to mail a letter to her mother, carefully worded to avoid worry, she noticed a wanted poster freshly tacked to the wall. The face sketched there was familiar. John Red Garrett, wanted for murder in Kansas. She had seen him just yesterday, drinking whiskey in her husband's study. Sheriff Wade entered the post office as she stood frozen before the poster. He followed her gaze, and she saw his jaw tighten. Dangerous man, he commented casually. Been tracking him for months, but seems to have vanished into thin air. Emma felt the weight of knowledge like a stone in her stomach. She could end this now. Tell him where to find Red Garrett. But what would happen to her when McCready discovered her betrayal? And worse, what would happen to her family? These outlaws, she said carefully, they're like smoke, they're hard to grasp. Indeed, the sheriff agreed. Though smoke always leaves a trail for those who know how to follow it. Carlos appeared in the doorway, impatient. Mrs. McCready, we should head back. Sheriff Wade stepped aside to let her pass, but not before she saw the question in his eyes. She gave the slightest shake of her head. Not yet. Not now. The ride home was silent except for the creak of wagon wheels and the cry of hawks overhead. Emma's mind churned with possibilities and dangers. She was trapped between two worlds, the lawless realm of her husband and the justice represented by Daniel Wade's badge. Neither offered safety, but one at least offered hope. That evening, McCready returned with 3 new men and a string of horses whose brands were still healing. He was in high spirits, pulling her onto his lap at dinner and regaling his men with tales of their successful negotiation with a rancher who had been reluctant to sell. My beautiful wife, he announced, whiskey slurring his words slightly. The jewel of Cedar Ridge. Aren't you happy here, Emma? Don't I give you everything? Yes, Jake, she replied, the lie bitter on her tongue. Later, as she lay rigid beside his snoring form, Emma stared at the ceiling and thought about Sheriff Wade's words. His door was always open, but walking through it might cost more than she could pay. For now, she would watch and wait, gathering knowledge like ammunition. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote howled, and Emma wondered if it felt as trapped as she did, caught between the wild and the civilized, belonging to neither. The McCready Ranch was a prison of silk and stolen gold, but even prisons could be escaped. She just had to find the right moment and the courage to take it. The thunderstorm broke just after midnight, rattling the windows of the McCready Ranch with violent fury. Emma lay awake, listening to the rain pound the roof and her husband's heavy breathing beside her. But it wasn't the storm that had stolen her sleep. It was the conversation she'd overheard earlier that evening. She had been mending one of Jake's shirts in the parlor when raised voices drew her attention to the study. The door, usually locked tight, stood slightly ajar. Through the gap, she could see her husband and Buck Hartley bent over a map spread across the desk. Patterson won't sell, Buck was saying. Old fool says he'd rather lose the ranch to the bank than deal with us. Then we'll have to convince him otherwise, McCready had replied, his tone carrying a dark promise. A man can be reasonable when his barn catches fire, or when his prize bull turns up dead, or when something happens to that pretty daughter of his. Buck had added with an ugly laugh. Emma's blood had run cold. She knew the Pattersons, good people who'd helped her family during the worst of the drought. Mary Patterson was only 17, a sweet girl who sang in the church choir. Now, hours later, the weight of that knowledge pressed down on her. When morning came, she found McCready already gone, leaving only a note saying he'd be away for several days on business. The relief she felt at his absence warred with dread over what that business might entail. She spent the morning helping Rosa prepare preserves, trying to lose herself in the familiar rhythm of domestic work. But her mind kept returning to Mary Patterson's innocent face and the sheriff's words about open doors. Just after noon, Carlos announced a visitor. Emma's heart leaped, thinking it might be Sheriff Wade, but instead found herself facing a well-dressed stranger with cold blue eyes and a banker's soft hands. "Mrs. McCready," he said, removing his hat. "William Thornby, from the Territorial Bank. I have business with your husband." "He's away at present," Emma replied carefully. "Perhaps you could return next week." Thornby's smile was thin as paper. "Actually, it's fortuitous that I found you alone. You see, your husband and I have certain arrangements that sometimes require a woman's delicate touch." Emma's wariness deepened. "I'm afraid I don't understand." "There's a social gathering next week at Judge Brennan's home. Very exclusive. Your husband wishes you to attend and to be especially charming to certain guests. Men who might be persuaded to see things our way regarding some upcoming land disputes." The implication was clear. She was to be used as bait, a pretty distraction while McCready and his associates maneuvered for advantage. Emma felt sick. "I'll need to discuss this with my husband," she said firmly. "Oh, he's already agreed," Thornby assured her. "In fact, he insisted, said you had a way of making men feel comfortable. That's a valuable skill in our line of work." After Thornby left, Emma saddled her mare, a wedding gift from McCready that represented her only real freedom. She told Carlos she was riding to clear her head after the banker's visit, and he, perhaps sensing her distress, didn't insist on accompanying her. She rode hard toward town, needing to move, to feel something other than the walls closing in. The storm had left the trail muddy and treacherous, but she pressed on, driven by a desperation she couldn't name. It was at Willow Creek Crossing that disaster struck. A group of men emerged from the cottonwoods, rough-looking drifters with whiskey-reddened eyes and weeks of trail dust on their clothes. Emma recognized the type, men who lived on the edges of law and civilization, taking what they wanted. Well, the largest of them drawled, blocking her path. "What's a pretty lady doing out here all alone?" "I'm Mrs. Jake McCready," she said, lifting her chin and hoping the name would protect her. "My husband won't take kindly to anyone bothering me." The men exchanged glances, and she realized her mistake. These weren't locals who feared McCready's reputation. They were strangers who saw only a woman alone with a fine horse. "McCready, huh?" The leader spat tobacco juice. "Never heard of him. But that's a nice mare you're riding. Think we'll take her, maybe take you too, for company." Emma wheeled her horse, but another man grabbed the bridle. Panic rose in her throat as rough hands reached for her. She struck out with her riding crop, catching one across the face, but there were too many. The sound of hoofbeats made them all turn. Sheriff Wade crested the rise at full gallop, his badge glinting in the afternoon sun and his gun already drawn. Let her go, he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of law and barely controlled rage. Now! The drifters hesitated, calculating odds, 5 against 1. But the one wore a badge and had the look of a man who knew how to use the Colt in his hand. This ain't your business, Sheriff, the leader tried. We're just having a friendly chat with the lady. Mrs. McCready is a citizen of my town, Wade replied, never taking his eyes off them. That makes her my business. You've got 3 seconds to step away from her horse. Emma felt the tension stretch taut. Then, like a snapping wire, it broke. The drifters released her horse and backed away, hands carefully visible. No harm done, the leader said, attempting a conciliatory smile. Just a misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding, Wade said coldly, is you thinking you could assault a woman in my jurisdiction. Clear out. If I see any of you in Cedar Ridge, I'll arrest you on sight. The men grumbled but mounted their horses and rode off, throwing dark looks over their shoulders. Only when they were out of sight did Wade holster his gun and approach Emma. Are you hurt? He asked, his professional mask slipping to reveal genuine concern. No, she managed, though her hands shook on the reins. Just frightened. How did you... I was checking on the Patterson ranch, he explained. Heard there might be trouble heading their way. Saw you riding hard and followed. He paused, studying her face. What were you doing out here alone? The concern in his voice nearly undid her. She wanted to tell him everything about Patterson, about Thornby, about the web tightening around her. Instead, she said, I needed to think. It's dangerous to think alone out here, he said gently. Ride back with me? They rode side by side through the recovering prairie, the silence between them comfortable despite everything. Emma found herself stealing glances at him, noting the way he sat his horse with easy confidence, the way his eyes constantly scanned for danger. Sheriff, she began, then stopped. How could she betray her husband without betraying herself? Daniel, he corrected. When we're alone, call me Daniel. I can't, she whispered. It wouldn't be proper. Nothing about your situation is proper, he said bluntly. Emma, Mrs. McCready, I know you didn't choose this. I know what kind of man your husband is. Then you know why I can't speak freely, she replied. They had reached the outskirts of town. Daniel reined in his horse, turning to face her fully. That day at the church, I should have spoken up, should have found a way to stop it. What could you have done? It was legal, a business arrangement. Illegal doesn't make it right. His jaw tightened. I've been investigating your husband for months. He's careful, but he'll make a mistake. When he does, I'll be ready. And what happens to me when that day comes? Emma asked, voicing the fear that haunted her nights. Daniel's expression softened. I'll protect you, that's a promise. As they parted ways at the edge of town, he to his office, she back to the ranch. Emma carried his promise like a secret flame. But she also carried the weight of what she knew about the Pattersons, about Thornby's plans, about the violence closing in on innocent people. That evening, alone in the vast house, she made a decision. At her writing desk, she penned a brief note. Patterson Ranch, 3 nights hence, fire. She sealed it carefully, addressed it to Sheriff D. Wade, and hid it in her jewelry box. Tomorrow, when she went to town for the church social, she would find a way to deliver it. It was a small betrayal, she told herself, just enough to save lives without revealing her source. But she knew she had crossed a line. There would be no going back now. Outside, coyotes howled in the darkness, and Emma wondered if Daniel Wade would keep his promise when the reckoning came. The frontier was an unforgiving place, but perhaps, in the shadow of its harsh justice, she might find a different kind of freedom. She just had to survive long enough to claim it. The church social buzzed with forced cheer, townspeople gathering in their Sunday best to pretend, for a few hours, that Cedar Ridge wasn't dying a slow death under the weight of drought and fear. Emma stood near the refreshment table, her note to Sheriff Wade burning like a coal in her glove. She had hoped to slip it to him discreetly, but McCready had returned unexpectedly that morning, insisting on accompanying her. "Smile, my dear," Jake murmured in her ear, his hand possessive on her waist. "We must present a united front." Across the room, she could see Daniel Wade speaking with Judge Brennan, his expression serious. The judge kept shaking his head, clearly reluctant about whatever the sheriff was proposing. Emma knew Daniel had been building a case against McCready's operations, but the corruption ran deep, and even honest men feared to act. "Mrs. McCready." Banker Thornby appeared at her elbow, accompanied by a thin man with nervous eyes. "May I present Mr. Eugene Garrett from the Railroad Company? He's very interested in hearing about the development opportunities in our region." Emma recognized the trap. This was what McCready had prepared her for, to charm and distract while the men conducted their real business. She forced a smile and engaged Garrett in conversation about the weather and the challenges of frontier life, all while her mind raced for a way to deliver her warning. Her opportunity came when young Mary Patterson approached with a tray of cookies. The girl's innocent smile made Emma's heart clench, knowing what fate awaited her family if McCready's plans proceeded. "Mary," Emma said warmly, "would you be so kind as to take this handkerchief to Sheriff Wade? I believe I dropped it near his office earlier, and I'd hate for him to think me careless." She pressed the linen square into Mary's hand, the note folded inside. The girl nodded eagerly, happy to help, and hurried off. Emma watched her go with a mixture of relief and dread. "Clever," McCready said quietly beside her. His tone was casual, but she felt the threat beneath. Using the Patterson girl as a messenger. I wonder what message was so urgent. Emma's blood ran cold, but she kept her voice steady. "Merely returning property. As I said, the sheriff was kind enough to assist me when my horse stumbled last week. Ah, yes, your ride. Carlos mentioned you seemed upset after Thornby's visit." His gray eyes studied her like a specimen. "You wouldn't be developing feelings for our stalwart lawman, would you?" "Don't be ridiculous," she replied, allowing a note of indignation to color her voice. "I know my place. Jake, I'm your wife." "Indeed you are," he agreed, "and wives share their husbands' fortunes, both good and bad, remember that." The threat was clear. Whatever happened to him would happen to her. They were bound together in the eyes of the law and the judgment of God, for better or worse. And Emma was beginning to understand just how much worse it could get. The rest of the social passed in a blur. Emma played her part, charming Garrett and the other potential investors McCready had marked, while inside she wondered if Daniel had received her note, if he would act on it, if the Pattersons would be safe. As they prepared to leave, Sheriff Wade approached. Emma's heart hammered, but his expression revealed nothing. "Mr. McCready," he said formally, "a word about the recent cattle thefts. Several ranchers have reported losses." "Terrible business," McCready replied smoothly. "I've instructed my men to be extra vigilant. Can't have rustlers threatening honest folks' livelihood." The irony was thick enough to choke on, but Daniel merely nodded. "I appreciate your cooperation, Mrs. McCready." He touched his hat brim, and she saw his fingers brush the pocket where she'd seen him tuck something white. Her handkerchief. Message received. The next 2 days passed with agonizing slowness. McCready was often closeted in his study with Buck and the others, planning something that required maps and heated discussions. Emma went about her household duties, aware that Carlos and even Rosa watched her more closely now. On the third night, she lay rigid beside her sleeping husband, listening to the clock tick toward midnight. If Daniel had understood her warning, he would be at the Patterson Ranch now, waiting for McCrady's men. If not, the sound of horses departing made her rise carefully and peer out the window. A group of riders disappeared into the darkness, led by Buck Hartley. McCready slept on, which meant he'd kept himself clear of tonight's dirty work. Maintaining his veneer of respectability, unable to bear the waiting, Emma slipped on her wrapper and crept downstairs. The house felt different at night, shadows pooling in corners and every creak seeming loud as gunfire. She made her way to the kitchen, where a lamp burned low. Rosa sat at the table, rosary beads moving through her fingers. She looked up at Emma's entrance, her weathered face grave. "You cannot sleep either, Senora." "No," Emma admitted, pouring water from the pitcher. "Too many worries. See, this house is full of worries and secrets." Rosa studied her carefully. "You are not like the others who come here. You have a good heart." "A good heart won't protect me," Emma said bitterly. "No, but a wise mind might." Rosa glanced toward the door, then leaned forward. "I have worked for Senor McCready for 5 years. I see much, say nothing, but you should know. He keeps records, in the safe behind the painting in his study. Records of every deal, every transaction." Emma's pulse quickened. Such records would be invaluable to Daniel's investigation. But accessing them would be beyond dangerous. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I had a daughter once," Rosa said simply. "She had your spirit, your courage. She died trying to escape a man like your husband." She crossed herself. "I could not save her. Perhaps I can save you." Before Emma could respond, the thunder of approaching horses filled the air. Too soon. Buck's men shouldn't return for hours unless... The kitchen door burst open. Buck Hartley stood there, soot-stained and furious, blood seeping from a gash on his forehead. "Where is he?" Buck demanded. "Where's McCready?" "Upstairs," Emma managed. "What happened?" "Sheriff was waiting for us," Buck snarled. "Had a dozen men hidden around the Patterson place. We rode right into an ambush, lost 3 men and barely got away." His eyes narrowed dangerously. "Someone told him we were coming." Emma forced her expression to remain neutral, even as her heart raced. Perhaps the Pattersons hired protection. They knew they were targets. Maybe. Buck's gaze bored into her. Or maybe we've got a rat. McCready appeared in the doorway, fully dressed despite the hour. He took in Buck's condition with cold calculation. "Report," he commanded. As Buck related the failed raid, Emma saw her husband's face darken. When the tale was done, McCready turned to her with a smile that chilled her blood. "My dear wife," he said softly, "you were so helpful with the Patterson girl at the social, so thoughtful to return the sheriff's handkerchief." "Jake, don't," the word cracked like a whip. "I'm not a fool, Emma. You think I didn't have you watched? That I didn't know about your little ride? Your cozy chat with Wade?" Emma lifted her chin, finding courage in desperation. "I won't be party to burning out innocent families, to threatening young girls. You'll be party to whatever I say." McCready replied. "Or have you forgotten? Your father's debts aren't fully paid. One word from me, and your family loses everything. Your brother Tom is, what, 15? Prison would be hard on a boy that age." The threat hit home, as he'd known it would. Emma felt her defiance crumble. She had thought only of saving the Pattersons, not of the consequences for her own family. "However," McCready continued, his tone shifting to something almost conversational, "this presents an opportunity. Sheriff Wade clearly has feelings for you. Feelings we can use. No. Yes. His smile was cold as winter moonlight. You'll continue your friendship with our noble lawman. You'll learn what he knows, who his sources are, what evidence he's gathered, and you'll report everything to me. I won't spy for you. You will, because the alternative is watching your family destroyed, your father in prison, your mother taking in washing to survive, your brother on the streets. He cupped her chin, forcing her to meet his eyes. You wanted to play with fire, my dear. Now you'll learn what it means to burn. He released her and turned to Buck. Double the guards, and have someone watch her at all times. My wife needs to learn that marriage means loyalty. As the men departed to tend their wounds and plan their next move, Emma remained in the kitchen with Rosa. The older woman reached across the table and squeezed her hand. The safe, Rosa whispered urgently. Behind the painting of the stallion, the combination is his wedding date, the real one, from his first marriage, October 15th, 1871. Emma stared at her. McCready had been married before, but there was no time for questions. She could hear boots on the stairs, guards taking up positions. Her prison had just become much smaller, but even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, Emma held tight to one thought. Daniel had acted on her warning. He'd saved the Pattersons, and now he knew for certain that someone inside McCready's organization was willing to help. She just had to survive long enough for that help to matter. The game had changed, the stakes raised beyond anything she'd imagined. But Emma Thornton McCready had learned something in these hard weeks. She was stronger than she'd known, and she wasn't finished fighting yet. The morning of the 5th day dawned gray and oppressive, matching Emma's mood as she stood at her bedroom window. Below, armed guards patrolled the grounds like wolves circling prey. McCready had made good on his threat. She hadn't been allowed to leave the ranch since the failed Patterson raid. Breakfast, Senora, Rosa announced, entering with a tray. But as she set it down, Emma noticed something tucked beneath the plate, a small folded paper. From the sheriff, Rosa whispered, through many hands to reach you safely. Emma's fingers trembled as she unfolded the note. Daniel's handwriting was brief but clear. Federal Marshal Thompson arriving tomorrow. Have evidence. Be ready. Burn this. She touched the paper to the lamp flame and watched it curl to ash. Federal involvement meant Daniel had taken his case beyond the corrupt local judges. It also meant the danger had escalated beyond anything they'd faced before. That afternoon, McCready summoned her to his study. The painting of the stallion seemed to mock her with its secret, so close, yet impossibly out of reach with guards constantly present. You'll accompany me to town today, he announced. Judge Brennan is hosting that dinner Thornby arranged. Time for you to earn your keep. I thought I was confined to the ranch, Emma said carefully. Under guard, you may go where I send you. His smile was sharp. Besides, I want Wade to see us together. Let him know exactly who you belong to. The ride to town felt like a funeral procession. Emma sat beside her husband in the enclosed carriage, Buck Hartley riding alongside with 4 other men. She wore the emerald silk dress McCready had chosen, feeling like a decorated prisoner being paraded to execution. Judge Brennan's house blazed with lamplight, carriages lining the drive. Inside, the cream of territorial society mingled, ranchers, businessmen, their wives in imported finery. And standing near the fireplace, looking uncomfortable in his formal coat, was Sheriff Daniel Wade. Their eyes met across the room, and Emma saw the quickly suppressed flash of concern. He started toward them, but McCready's hand tightened on her arm. Remember your family, he murmured. One wrong word tonight, and by morning your father will be in chains. The evening proceeded like a nightmare wrapped in silk. Emma smiled, conversed, played the devoted wife while inside she screamed. She could feel Daniel's gaze following her, could sense his growing anger at her apparent comfort in this nest of corruption. During dinner, she found herself seated between Thornby and a railroad executive named Pemberton. The conversation turned to land acquisitions and the need to clear out unproductive elements from prime territory. Emma understood they meant families like the Pattersons, the Millers, anyone who wouldn't sell to McCrady's syndicate. "Your husband has vision," Pemberton told her. "This territory needs men willing to do what's necessary for progress." "Yes," she agreed, hating herself. "Jake is very determined." Across the table, she caught Daniel's look of disgust. He thought she'd been turned, thought she'd chosen comfort over conscience. The pain of that misjudgment cut deep, but she couldn't risk correcting it. After dinner, the men retired for cigars and brandy while the women gathered in the parlor. Emma escaped to the garden, needing air, needing space from the suffocating pretense. She'd barely reached the rose arbor when a hand caught her elbow. Daniel stepped from the shadows, his face hard with anger. "Don't," he said when she opened her mouth. "I don't want to hear excuses. I thought you were different, thought you wanted out. But here you are, playing hostess for these vultures. You don't understand." "I understand plenty. McCrady offers you pretty dresses and a big house, and suddenly burning out families doesn't seem so bad?" The injustice of it broke something in Emma. "My family," she whispered urgently. "He's threatening my family, my father, my brother. He'll destroy them if I don't obey." Daniel's expression shifted. "Emma!" "No, listen." She gripped his hands, desperate to make him understand. "I tried to help. I'm still trying. But he knows. He's watching everything I do, and there are guards." "Sheriff Wade." Buck Hartley's voice cut through the darkness like a blade. "Mighty improper, finding you alone with another man's wife." Daniel released her hands slowly, turning to face Buck with dangerous calm. Mrs. McCready seemed distressed. "I was merely inquiring after her welfare." "How thoughtful." Buck's hand rested on his gun. "Jake's looking for her. Best you run along now. Sheriff, unless you want to discuss this further." The two men faced each other, violence crackling in the air between them. Emma stepped forward quickly. "Mr. Hartley is right," she said, hating the tremor in her voice. "I should return to my husband." She walked away without looking back, feeling Daniel's eyes on her until she disappeared inside. McCrady waited in the entry hall, his expression unreadable. "Enjoying the gardens?" he asked mildly. "I needed air," she replied, "and found the sheriff instead. How convenient." He offered his arm. "Come, time to go home." The ride back was silent until they were nearly at the ranch. Then McCrady spoke, his voice conversational. "I've been thinking about your family. Perhaps I should invite them to visit. Your brother Tom especially. Boy his age should learn about business. Buck could teach him about our operations." The threat was clear. Tom would become a hostage to ensure her cooperation. Emma's hands clenched in her lap. "That's thoughtful of you," she managed. "I'm a thoughtful man. Ask anyone." His smile was cold in the lamplight. "Well, anyone still alive to ask?" Back at the ranch, Emma was escorted to her room by 2 guards. She could hear McCrady and Buck talking downstairs, making plans. Through her window, she could see riders coming and going. Something big was being prepared. Near midnight, unable to sleep, she heard a commotion in the yard. Peering out, she saw Buck and several men dragging someone from a horse. The prisoner's head was covered by a grain sack, but she recognized the badge glinting on his chest. They had captured one of Daniel's deputies. Emma pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a gasp. Through the window, she could hear Buck's harsh laughter. He found him sniffing around the old Martinez place. Buck reported to McCready, who had emerged from the house. "Asking questions about our business." "Take him to the grain shed," McCready ordered. "We'll find out what Wade knows, then dispose of him where it'll send a message." Emma watched them drag the deputy away, her mind racing. She had to do something. But what? She was watched, trapped, helpless. No, not helpless. Rosa's words echoed. The safe, October 15th, 1871. If federal marshals were coming tomorrow, they'd need evidence. Real evidence, not just the word of a desperate woman. And that evidence was sitting in McCready's study, behind an oil painting of a stallion. Emma made her decision, moving quietly. She opened her jewelry box and withdrew the small pistol her mother had given her as a wedding gift, for protection on the frontier. She'd never thought she'd need it against her own husband. The house had settled into late-night quiet. Emma could hear the guard outside her door shifting occasionally, probably fighting sleep. She waited another hour, then knocked softly. "I'm ill," she called weakly. Please, I need Rosa, the woman's complaint." The guard, a young man named Jefferson who still retained some manners, shifted uncomfortably. The boss said, "Please." Emma let tears enter her voice. "It's urgent. You can accompany us if you must. But I need her remedies." Footsteps, muffled discussion. Then Rosa appeared with Jefferson hovering behind her. The old woman took in Emma's fully dressed state and the determination in her eyes. "Si, senora, I understand. Come, we go to the kitchen for the herbs." They made their way downstairs, Jefferson following awkwardly. In the kitchen, Rosa busied herself at the stove while Emma sat at the table, making a show of distress. "The tea will take time," Rosa announced. "You sit guard, boy. No need to stand all night." Jefferson, clearly uncomfortable with female troubles, gratefully took a chair by the door. Rosa began grinding herbs, the rhythmic sound strangely soothing. She added something to the guard's coffee when he wasn't looking. Nothing harmful, just something to ensure deep sleep. Within 20 minutes, Jefferson's head was nodding. Within 30, he was snoring softly. Rosa and Emma exchanged glances. "You have perhaps 1 hour," Rosa whispered. "Go, I will watch." Emma slipped through the darkened house to McCready's study. Her hands shook as she lifted the stallion painting from the wall, revealing the safe behind. October 15th, 1871. The tumblers clicked, and the door swung open. Inside were ledgers, contracts, and correspondence, a complete record of McCready's criminal empire. Names, dates, amounts, murders planned and executed, everything Daniel would need. But there was something else, something that made Emma's blood run cold. A letter from Thornby discussing the federal marshal's arrival. They knew. They were planning an ambush at Miller's Crossing, where the road narrowed between high rocks. Marshal Thompson would never reach Cedar Ridge alive. Emma gathered the most damning documents, her mind racing, and she had to warn Daniel, had to save the deputy, had to get this evidence out. But how? Then she heard it, footsteps in the hall, McCready's voice getting closer. There was no time to close the safe, no time to rehang the painting. Emma did the only thing she could. She threw open the study window and fired her pistol into the air 3 times. The universal signal for distress. Then she tossed the bundled documents out into the darkness and spun to face the door as it burst open. McCready stood there, taking in the open safe, the window, the gun in her hand. His face went dark with rage. "You little fool," he snarled. "Do you know what you've done?" "What I should have done weeks ago," Emma replied, surprised by her own steady voice. The sound of horses filled the night, riders responding to her gunshots. McCready grabbed her arm, twisting the pistol away. "Buck," he shouted, "get the men, we're under attack." But the first rider to appear at the window wasn't one of McCrady's men. It was Sheriff Daniel Wade, his badge glinting in the moonlight and his gun aimed steady at McCrady's head. "Let her go, McCrady," he commanded. "It's over. Federal marshals have surrounded the ranch. Your men are throwing down their weapons as we speak." It was a bluff. It had to be. The marshals weren't due until tomorrow, but McCrady didn't know that. His grip on Emma's arm tightened painfully. "She's my wife," he snarled. "My property, and you have no right—" "She's evidence of your crimes," Daniel countered, "and she's under my protection now. Let her go." For a moment, the world balanced on a knife's edge. Then more riders appeared, Daniel's deputies, armed and ready. The gunfire from the yard suggested McCrady's men were indeed being overwhelmed. McCrady's hand moved toward his hidden derringer, and Emma knew with terrible clarity that he'd rather see her dead than free. Time slowed as his hand closed on the weapon. The window exploded inward as Daniel dove through, tackling McCrady to the ground. The derringer fired, the bullet going wild, and then the two men were grappling on the study floor. Emma scrambled for her fallen pistol as Buck Hartley burst through the door. Without thinking, she raised the weapon and fired. Buck staggered back, clutching his shoulder, his gun clattering away. Daniel's fist connected with McCrady's jaw with a satisfying crack. The outlaw went limp, finally defeated. Daniel rose, breathing hard, and looked at Emma with something like wonder. "You saved my life," he said. "You saved mine first," she replied, "and then, because the world was ending and beginning all at once." She threw herself into his arms. He held her as she shook, whispering assurances while his deputies flooded the room. Outside, the night erupted with shouts and gunfire as the raid concluded. But in that moment, in the circle of Daniel's arms, Emma felt something she'd thought lost forever. Safety, hope, and maybe, just maybe, the first stirring of a love built on courage and trust rather than fear and possession. The battle wasn't over. There would be trials, testimony, the freeing of her family from McCrady's threats. But as dawn began to paint the eastern sky, Emma knew the darkest night had passed. She was free. The morning after the raid, Cedar Ridge buzzed like a disturbed hive. News traveled fast on the frontier, and by the time Emma emerged from the sheriff's office, where she'd spent the night giving her statement to Federal Marshal Thompson, half the town had gathered on Main Street. She pulled her shawl tighter, acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed her progress. Some faces showed sympathy, others curiosity, and a few displayed outright hostility. McCrady had owned more people than she'd realized, through debt, fear, or greed. "Oh, Jezebel," someone hissed from the crowd. Emma recognized Mrs. Hartley, Buck's mother, her face twisted with grief and rage. "You shot my boy." "Your boy was fixing to shoot me," Daniel said firmly, appearing at Emma's side. His presence was solid and reassuring, his badge a shield against the crowd's judgment. "He'll live to stand trial, which is more mercy than he showed his victims." Mrs. Hartley spat at Emma's feet before being led away by friends. Emma stood frozen, the reality of her situation crashing over her. She was free of McCrady, yes. But what place did she have in this town now? The wife who'd betrayed her husband, the woman who'd shot a man, the fool who'd trusted a sheriff's promise. "Come on," Daniel said quietly, guiding her away from the crowd. "Let's get you somewhere safe." But where was safe? The ranch was a crime scene, crawling with federal agents cataloging evidence. Her family's farm was still mortgaged to the bank, though Marshal Thompson had promised to investigate the illegal interest rates. She had no money of her own, no friends who dare associate with her now. Daniel seemed to read her thoughts. "Mrs. Morrison has agreed to take you in. The parsonage has a spare room, and you'll be under the Reverend's protection." The irony wasn't lost on her, seeking sanctuary in the same church where her nightmare had begun. But what choice did she have? The next weeks passed in a blur of legal proceedings. Emma testified before the federal judge, detailing everything she'd witnessed and overheard. McCready, shackled and guarded, watched her from across the courtroom with eyes that promised retribution. Buck Hartley, his arm in a sling, looked away when she described finding the deputy in the grain shed, alive, thankfully, though bearing marks of torture. The evidence from McCready's safe proved damning. Names, dates, bribes paid, murders ordered. The territorial governor himself was implicated, along with 2 federal judges and dozens of local officials. The scandal reached all the way to Washington, they said. Through it all, Daniel was her constant protector, walking her to and from the courthouse, standing guard during her testimony, but he maintained a careful distance, proper and professional. Emma understood why. She was still a married woman in the eyes of the law, and any hint of impropriety would undermine the case. One evening, as she sat in the parsonage parlor mending a dress, Mrs. Morrison brought unexpected news. "There's talk of sending you back east," the older woman said gently. "Marshal Thompson thinks it might be safer until all of McCready's associates are rounded up." Emma's hand stilled on the fabric. "Leave Cedar Ridge. Leave." "Daniel?" "I see," she managed. "It might be for the best," Mrs. Morrison continued. "A fresh start, away from all this ugliness. You're young still. You could build a new life." That night, Emma lay awake wrestling with the decision. Part of her wanted to run, to leave behind the stares and whispers and memories, but another part, a stronger part, rebelled at the thought. She'd fought for her freedom. Why should she be the one to leave? The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Rosa stood at the parsonage door, a basket in her weathered hands. "I bring breakfast," she announced, pushing past a surprised Mrs. Morrison. Once they were alone, she fixed Emma with knowing eyes. "You think of running. Marshal Thompson believes it would be safer." "Safer, see, but not better." Rosa unpacked warm tortillas and fresh eggs. "You know what I learn, working in houses of powerful men? They want you to run, makes their victory complete, but you stay, you fight, you build something new that drives them crazy. The whole town thinks I'm a traitor, or worse. Some do, others they whisper different, say you were brave, say you saved lives." Rosa leaned forward. "The Patterson girl, Mary, she tells everyone how you warned them. The Deputy Martinez, he lives because you acted. These stories spread too, slower than gossip but stronger." Emma felt tears prick her eyes. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to stay. You were strong enough to shoot Buck Hartley, strong enough to stand in court and speak truth. This?" Rosa gestured dismissively. "This is just waiting for dust to settle." That afternoon, Daniel found her in the church garden, tending the vegetable plot Mrs. Morrison had assigned her. "I heard you might be leaving," he said without preamble. Emma didn't look up from her weeding. "Marshal Thompson thinks it's wise. Marshal Thompson doesn't know you like I do." He crouched beside her, his presence warm and solid. "Emma, look at me." She did, finding his brown eyes full of something that made her heart race. "I know these weeks have been hard," he said. "I know the town's been cruel, but running won't solve anything. Your family needs you here. The trial's not over. We need your testimony for the remaining defendants." He paused. "And I need you to stay." "Daniel," she whispered, "you know we can't. I'm still married." "McCready will hang," he said bluntly. "The evidence is overwhelming. Murder, conspiracy, corruption. He'll swing before winter comes. And then, he didn't finish, but Emma heard the promise in his silence. When she was free, truly free, he'd be waiting. Sheriff Wade, a deputy's shout interrupted the moment. Trouble at the bank. Daniel rose, duty calling. But before he left, he pressed something into her hand, a small silver badge, worn smooth with age. My father's, he said. He was a sheriff too, back in Kansas. Taught me that the law isn't just about punishing the guilty. It's about protecting the innocent, helping folks rebuild after tragedy. You did that, Emma. You upheld the law when it cost you everything. He closed her fingers around the badge. Keep it. Remember that you belong here as much as anyone. That evening, the town council met to discuss the aftermath of McCrady's arrest. Emma watched from the parsonage window as prominent citizens filed into the meeting hall. An hour later, Daniel appeared at the door. They're seizing McCrady's assets, he reported, using them to compensate his victims. Your father's debts, they're void. The interest rates were criminal. Your family's farm is safe. Emma sagged with relief. Thank God. There's more. They're looking for someone to manage the relief fund, help distribute the money fairly. I suggested you. Me? Emma stared at him. Daniel, half the town. He needs to see you're not going anywhere, that you're part of this community's healing. His expression softened. Besides, who better than someone who knows firsthand what McCrady's cruelty cost? The offer was a lifeline, a chance to rebuild not just her life but her reputation. It would be hard. There would be those who'd never forgive her betrayal of her husband, no matter how justified. But there would be others, like the Pattersons, who'd remember she'd risked everything to save them. I'll think about it, she promised. Daniel smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. That's all I ask. Well, that and one more thing. What? You stop calling me Sheriff Wade. We've been through too much for formality. Despite everything, Emma found herself smiling back. All right. Daniel, the next day she sent word to Marshal Thompson she would not be going east. Cedar Ridge was her home, for better or worse. She had work to do here, wrongs to help right, a community to help heal. And maybe, when the dust settled and the law had run its course, she'd have something more. Something built on mutual respect and shared courage rather than debt and fear. Rosa had been right. Staying was harder than running. But as Emma walked through town the next morning, head high despite the whispers, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. The sun broke through the clouds as she reached the bank, where a small crowd had gathered to hear about the relief fund. Some faces were still hostile, but others showed cautious interest. Mary Patterson waved shyly from beside her parents. Deputy Martinez, still walking with a cane, tipped his hat respectfully. Emma took a deep breath and stepped forward to address her neighbors. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but she'd traveled harder paths. And this time, she wouldn't be walking alone. Behind her, almost unnoticed, Daniel Wade stood watch, not as her protector now, but as her equal, her partner in rebuilding what McCrady had tried to destroy. The frontier was changing, slowly but surely, and they would help shape its future together, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of courage building on another, until even the deepest wounds could heal. The autumn wind carried the scent of change through Cedar Ridge as Emma stood before Judge Harrison in the packed courtroom. 6 months had passed since McCrady's arrest, and today, finally, would bring the end of one chapter and perhaps the beginning of another. Jake McCready, the judge intoned, his voice heavy with the weight of justice. You have been found guilty of murder, conspiracy, extortion, and crimes too numerous to list. It is the judgment of this court that you be taken from this place and hanged by the neck until dead. McCready stood in chains, his once fine clothes replaced by rough prison garb. His gray eyes found Emma's across the courtroom, but the malice that once lived there had been replaced by something hollow. Defeated. She held his gaze steadily until he looked away. Furthermore, Judge Harrison continued, this court hereby grants the petition for dissolution of marriage between Jake McCready and Emma Thornton McCready on grounds of criminal coercion and threats of violence. Mrs. Thornton, you are free. Free. The word echoed through Emma like a bell. She felt Daniel's presence behind her, steady and reassuring, though he maintained proper distance in the public setting. Outside the courthouse, the town had gathered. Some came for spectacle, others for closure. Emma emerged into the afternoon sunlight to find her family waiting. Her father, aged but proud. Her mother tearful with relief. And Tom, now 16 and standing taller than she remembered. Come home, Emma, her mother pleaded. Your room is waiting. Emma embraced them each in turn but shook her head gently. I'll visit, Mama. Often. But I have work here in town. The relief fund still needs managing, and I've taken a position with the new bank president. It was more than that. Of course, in the months of managing McCready's seized assets, distributing compensation to his victims, Emma had discovered an aptitude for numbers and negotiation. The new bank president, brought in from Denver to clean up the corruption, had been impressed enough to offer her genuine employment. Besides, Tom said with a knowing grin, I bet the sheriff would miss her something terrible if she left town. Thomas Thornton, their mother scolded, but Emma saw the speculative gleam in her eye. Indeed, Daniel Wade had been a constant presence these past months, always proper, always respectful, but with an undercurrent of something warmer waiting just beneath the surface. They'd worked together on countless aspects of the town's recovery, he handling the legal matters while she managed the financial restitution. As her family departed for their farm, Emma found herself walking toward the sheriff's office, drawn by habit and something more. She found Daniel at his desk, writing reports in his careful hand. It's done, she said simply. He looked up, and the smile that crossed his face was like sunrise. How do you feel? Like I can breathe again? She moved to the window, looking out at the town that had become truly hers through trial and hardship. Judge Harrison said the execution will be next week. Will you attend? Emma considered, then shook her head. No. I've seen enough of Jake McCready. I won't give him my presence at the end. Daniel rose and joined her at the window, standing close but not touching. Emma, I've waited to say this. Wanted to be sure all was legal and proper. Hey, Daniel, she interrupted softly. I know. Do you? He turned to face her fully. Do you know that I've thought of you every day since that morning in the church? That watching you marry him nearly killed me? That your courage in bringing him down amazed me more than any act of bravery I've seen? Emma's heart raced, but she forced herself to be practical. People will talk. The woman who betrayed her husband, taking up with the lawman who arrested him. Let them talk. His hand found hers, rough and warm. We know the truth. The people who matter know the truth. I'm not the same woman I was, Emma warned. These months have changed me. I won't be a quiet, obedient wife. I have work I love, responsibilities to this town. Good, Daniel said firmly. I don't want a quiet, obedient wife. I want a partner. Someone who'll stand beside me, challenge me, help me build something good here. Emma looked into his earnest brown eyes and saw the future stretching before them. Not easy, perhaps, but honest and true. Then perhaps you should court me properly. Sheriff Wade, I believe I'm free to receive callers now. His laugh was rich and warm. I'll call on you tomorrow. Miss Thornton, if that's acceptable? You're more than acceptable, she assured him. That evening, Emma worked late at the bank, reconciling accounts and preparing for the next day's relief fund disbursements. The work was satisfying in a way she'd never expected, bringing order from chaos, helping families rebuild their lives. Rosa appeared with a dinner basket, as had become her custom. The older woman had taken a position at the boarding house but still checked on Emma regularly. So, Rosa said without preamble, the sheriff will court you now? Emma blushed. News travels fast. In this town, of course. Rosa unpacked tamales and beans. It is good. You deserve happiness, real happiness, not the shadow of it that men like McCready offer. Some people won't approve, Emma said. Mrs. Hartley still crosses the street when she sees me. Mrs. Hartley's son is in prison for 15 years. Rosa replied pragmatically. Her anger needs a target, but others see differently. Just yesterday, Senora Patterson told everyone at the Mercantile how you saved their farm. Her daughter Mary speaks of you like a hero. I'm no hero. I was just trying to survive. Sometimes, Rosa said wisely. That is the most heroic thing of all. The next afternoon, true to his word. Daniel called at the boarding house where Emma had taken rooms. He brought flowers, wild asters from the prairie, and his best jacket was freshly brushed. They walked through town together, openly, properly. His arm offered and hers resting lightly upon it. Some folks stared, others nodded approval, but Emma found she cared less about their opinions than she'd expected. I've been thinking, Daniel said as they paused by the creek that ran behind the church. About the future, the town's growing, healing, the railroad's considering a spur line through here next year. We'll need good people to help manage that growth. Are we? Emma asked, though she knew what he meant. I'm hoping, he said carefully, that by the time spring comes I might have convinced a certain brilliant, brave woman to marry me, to be my wife and partner in all things. Emma's throat tightened with emotion. That's quite presumptuous, Sheriff. You've only been courting me for 1 day. True, he agreed, but I've been loving you considerably longer. The simple honesty of it undid her. Oh, Daniel, I know it's too soon to answer, he said quickly. I just wanted you to know my intentions. I'll court you properly for as long as you need. But Emma, I've waited through one wedding to another man, through months of investigation and trial. I'm not a patient man by nature, but for you, I'll learn. Emma reached up to touch his face, marveling at this good man who'd stood by her through the worst season of her life. I don't need as much time as you might think, she admitted. But yes, court me through the winter. Let the town see us together. Let them get used to the ideas, and when spring comes, When spring comes, he prompted, hope bright in his eyes. Ask me again, she said softly. I think you'll like my answer. He caught her hand and pressed it to his lips, a gesture both proper and intimate. I'll hold you to that. Emma Thornton. As they continued their walk, Emma felt the last chains of her old life falling away. Ahead lay winter, with its challenges and cold. But beyond that waited spring, season of new growth, new beginnings, new love rooted in trust and mutual respect. The sheriff's office came into view, and Emma saw Deputy Martinez teaching Tom how to properly clean a rifle. Her brother had been spending time there, drawn to the law and order that Daniel represented. It was good to see him finding his own path. "I should get back to the bank," Emma said reluctantly. "The Millers are coming in about their loan modification." "Of course." Daniel's pride in her work was evident. "Dinner tomorrow? The boarding house serves a decent pot roast on Thursdays." "I'd like that," Emma agreed. As she walked back through town, ledger under her arm and purpose in her stride, Emma marveled at how much had changed. The woman who'd stood at the altar with Jake McCready, frightened, trapped, powerless, was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who'd learned her own worth through fire and trial. The bank came into view, its windows gleaming in the afternoon sun. Inside waited work that mattered, people who needed her skills, a future she was building with her own hands. And tomorrow, dinner with a good man who saw her as an equal, not a possession. Emma Thornton had finally come home, not to a place but to herself. And that, more than any legal decree or social acceptance, was true freedom. The first wildflowers of spring dotted the prairie as Emma stood before the mirror in her childhood bedroom, adjusting the simple cream-colored dress she'd sewn herself. No silk or satin this time, no elaborate lace or imported pearls. Just honest cotton and her mother's cameo at her throat, a bride's attire chosen by her own hand, for her own joy. "You look beautiful," Sarah Thornton said from the doorway, tears glistening in her eyes. "And so happy, so different from last time," Emma finished gently. "Yes, Mama, everything is different now." Through the window, she could see guests gathering in the yard, not the crowd of curious onlookers and criminals who'd attended her first wedding, but friends and neighbors who'd stood by her through the dark months. The Pattersons had arrived early, Mary wearing a new dress and helping arrange wildflower bouquets. Deputy Martinez, fully recovered now, was directing wagons with his usual efficiency. Even some of McCready's former victims had come, viewing her marriage to Daniel as a final triumph over the man who'd terrorized them all. "The sheriff's here," Tom announced, poking his head into the room with a grin. "Looking nervous as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs." Emma laughed, the sound light and free. "Tell him I'll be down shortly," as her family left to take their places. Emma took a moment alone. So much had changed since that terrible morning when she'd stood in this same room, preparing to marry a monster to save her family. The woman in the mirror now was leaner, stronger, with calluses on her fingers from months of ledger work and a confidence in her bearing that came from surviving the worst and building something better from the ashes. The winter courtship had been everything she'd hoped, Daniel calling regularly, escorting her to church socials and town meetings, sharing quiet dinners and long walks. He'd been patient when nightmares woke her, understanding when she needed to work late at the bank, proud when she successfully negotiated better terms for struggling farmers. They'd built a foundation not on passion alone, but on respect, shared values, and genuine partnership. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Emma," Rosa's voice called. "It is time." Emma found the older woman waiting in the hall, dressed in her finest black dress with a bright shawl, a splash of color that spoke of celebration rather than mourning. "You came," Emma said, embracing her. "Of course, I would not miss seeing you claim the happiness you deserve." Rosa pulled back, studying her with those wise eyes. "No fear today?" "No fear," Emma confirmed. "Only joy." They descended the stairs together, and Emma stepped out into the spring afternoon. The ceremony would be held in the ranch yard, under the big oak tree that had shaded 3 generations of Thorntons. Reverend Morrison waited there, his face showing genuine pleasure rather than the reluctance of that other wedding. But it was Daniel who drew her gaze and held it. He stood tall and straight in his best suit, Not the formal coat he'd worn to official functions, but the simple brown wool he wore to church, pressed and clean. His sheriff's badge was pinned proudly to his lapel, catching the sun. When he saw her, his face lit with such pure happiness that Emma felt her heart might burst. Her father offered his arm, and this time she took it without dread. As they walked across the yard, Emma saw the faces of those who'd become her true community. Mrs. Murphy from the mercantile dabbed at her eyes. The bank president nodded approvingly. Even crusty old Judge Harrison had come. Standing with his wife near the refreshment table Rosa had helped prepare. "Who gives this woman to be married?" Reverend Morrison asked when they reached the oak tree. "Her mother and I do," Samuel Thornton replied, his voice strong. "With joy and blessing." He placed Emma's hand in Daniel's, and the rightness of it settled into her bones. Daniel's fingers were warm and steady, his touch a promise of all the days to come. "Dearly beloved," the Reverend began, and Emma almost laughed at how different the words sounded now. "We gather today in celebration, to witness the union of two people who have chosen each other freely, with full hearts and clear minds." The ceremony was simple, the vows traditional but spoken with feeling that transformed them into personal promises. Daniel's voice was husky with emotion as he pledged to love, honor, and cherish. Emma's rang clear as a bell as she promised to stand beside him in all things. "The rings?" Reverend Morrison asked. Tom stepped forward, importantly producing two simple gold bands, nothing elaborate, just honest metal to mark an honest union. Daniel slipped hers on with hands that trembled slightly. This brave man who'd faced down outlaws without flinching. Undone by the simple act of marrying the woman he loved. "By the power vested in me," Reverend Morrison proclaimed, beaming now. "I pronounce you husband and wife. Sheriff Wade, you may kiss your bride." Daniel cupped her face gently, his thumbs brushing her cheeks. "Mrs. Wade," he murmured, wonder in his voice. "Mr. Wade," she replied, and then he was kissing her, soft and sweet and full of promise, while their guests erupted in genuine celebration. The reception that followed was everything the first had not been, warm, joyful, filled with laughter and music. Tom had brought his fiddle, and soon couples were dancing on the swept barn floor. Emma found herself passed from partner to partner, each offering congratulations and welcome. "Never thought I'd see the day," Judge Harrison admitted as he led her through a reel. "That sheriff of yours is a patient man, and you, young woman, have become quite an asset to our community." "Thank you, Judge," Emma replied, "for everything, for seeing justice done." "Justice has a way of finding its own path," he said. "Sometimes it just needs brave souls to clear the way." As evening fell, Daniel finally reclaimed her for a waltz. They moved together easily, having learned each other's rhythms through the winter months. "Happy?" he asked softly. "Beyond words," Emma assured him. "Though I do have one concern." His brow furrowed. "What's that?" "The house you've rented. Does it have a suitable room for a study? I'll need space for the bank ledgers when I work from home." Daniel laughed, spinning her around. "Already arranged, and the kitchen is large enough for Rosa to teach you those recipes you've been wanting to learn. You think of everything." "I try." His expression grew serious. "Emma, I want you to know I'm proud of the work you do. I don't expect you to give it up. We're partners, remember?" "I remember," she said, love flooding through her. "Though I may need to reduce my hours come winter." "Ooh, why would you?" Daniel stopped dancing, his eyes widening. "Emma, are you saying—" "It's early yet," she said, suddenly shy. "But Rosa noticed signs, and I've been to see Dr. Hawkins. Come December, there'll be 3 of us." Daniel let out a whoop that turned every head, then kissed her soundly in front of God and everyone. A baby, he marveled. Our baby. Our baby, Emma confirmed, laughing at his joy. The celebration continued late into the night, but eventually, Daniel and Emma slipped away to the small house that would be their first home. It wasn't grand like the McCready Ranch, just a simple frame structure with a garden plot and a view of the mountains, but it was theirs, chosen and made ready together. "Wait," Daniel said as they reached the door. In one smooth motion, he swept her into his arms. "Tradition." Emma laughed, her arms around his neck as he carried her over the threshold. Inside, lamplight revealed the touches they'd each added, his books on law and history, her ledgers and correspondence from the bank, photographs of both their families, the rocking chair Rosa had given them as a wedding gift. "Welcome home, Mrs. Wade," Daniel said, setting her gently on her feet. "Welcome home, Sheriff," she replied and kissed him again, because she could, because she'd chosen this, because Joy was no longer a stranger but a resident in her heart. Later, as they stood on their small porch watching the stars emerge, Emma reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The frightened girl who'd married Jake McCready was gone, transformed by trials into a woman who knew her own strength. The future stretched before them, not without challenges, certainly, but faced together as equals. "No regrets?" Daniel asked, his arm warm around her shoulders. "None," Emma said firmly. "Every step led me here, to this moment, to you. How could I regret that?" In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and another answered. Not the lonely sound she remembered from her nights at the McCready Ranch, but a wild duet of creatures who'd found each other in the vast frontier. "I love you, Emma Wade," Daniel said simply. "And I love you, Daniel Wade," she replied, meaning it with every fiber of her being. The spring night wrapped around them, full of promise and new beginnings. Tomorrow would bring work, for him, maintaining law and order in a growing town. For her, helping build that town's economic future. There would be challenges as the railroad arrived, as Cedar Ridge transformed from a frontier outpost to a proper western town. There would be those who'd never fully accept her, who'd always see the shadow of her first marriage. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, there was only this, a man and woman who'd chosen each other freely, who'd built their love on a foundation of trust and mutual respect, who faced the future not with fear but with shared determination. Inside the house, in a drawer of the desk they'd share, lay the silver badge Daniel had given her months ago, his father's star, symbol of protection and justice. Emma had thought to return it, but Daniel had insisted she keep it. "You earned it," he'd said. "You upheld justice when it cost you everything. That makes you a defender of the law in my book." Now, as they prepared to begin their life together, Emma understood what he'd meant. Love in the frontier wasn't just romance and passion. It was partnership, courage, the daily choice to build something worthwhile in a hard land. It was knowing someone would stand beside you against whatever storms might come, would celebrate your victories and share your burdens. As the stars wheeled overhead and the prairie wind sang through the grass, Emma Wade closed her eyes and smiled. She had chosen this life, this man, this future, and in that choosing, she had finally, truly, come home.